An art style is a way to solve problems. The first time I heard this, it was about still art, like paintings or comic books. I love problem solving, so this framing really captivated me. What kind of problems could be solved in a painting? Well, as it turns out, the problem is pretty fundamental. You're trying to take images from our three-dimensional world and squash them onto a two-dimensional plane. Hyperrealism and cartooning are just two approaches to the same problem. How do I tell a story with only colors? If a picture doesn't solve its design problems, you'll probably just walk away. But if a video game doesn't solve its design problems, you might confuse and frustrate your player, and nobody wants angry gamers. But if art styles are a way to solve visual problems, and we have so many to choose from, how do you make the right decisions about what art styles to choose? I think I've boiled it down to about 4 factors, which I'm going to call feasibility, clarity, tone, and theme. Let's talk about it, and then tell me if I missed anything. I'm Dryden Thomas, and I'm developing Lighthoof, a melancholy Metroidvania focused on zippy combat and tight platforming, where you play as Lighthoof Noah, our deer-footed, skull-masked hero, armed with his floating light arrow, as he explores the secrets of a land strangled by deadly fog. If that sounds really cool to you and you want to support an indie dev, the best possible thing you can do right now is head over to Steam and give it a wish list. Alright, so number 1 is feasibility. Maybe you've imagined making a game before, and I bet you've thought about what it would look like. Maybe it would be colorful and shiny like Genshin Impact, or super gritty realistic like Call of Duty, or hyper stylized and cool like Persona. But let's assume you're a solo developer like me, or maybe a one-person art team. If you take a peek at the size of the teams behind those games, you'll realize that you need to pick an art style that's going to let you work quickly if you plan on releasing a game in this lifetime. So then the first thing you need to do is take stock of your game's needs and prioritize. So for example, I know Lighthoof is going to have lots of intense combat, and that means that every attack is going to have to be animated for every enemy. And to give the player some chance to react to the enemy, they're going to have some kind of wind-up on each attack. That's a lot of animating. To give you a little context, one of my bosses has 148 frames of animation. If I overcomplicate my designs and present too much detail, I'm going to be spending weeks every time I have to create a boss. So that's why I went with this pretty simplified style for the characters and enemies. It's readable to the player, and it doesn't take more than a few hours for a simple enemy and a few days for a boss to fully animate. That's still a lot of time, but since it's so core to the game, it's time I'm willing to spend. That said, other processes can be much faster than hand drawing if you know your tools. Some games quickly animate a more detailed 2D model by rigging up bones with the sprites and having them move. Afterimage is a great example of a Metroidvania that did this to beautiful effect. Other games like Ori and the Will of the Wisps or Dead Cells use 3D to model characters and animations, then turn each frame of the animation into a 2D sprite, pack those into sprite sheets, which are then used in the game. There's a bit more to it than that, but those small teams have created a lot of gorgeous art in a short time, which points toward that being a pretty efficient process. In the end, every development team has to look at the skills that they have and choose an art process that's sustainable. The next factor is clarity. In a game, you never want a player to be confused about where they can stand or what's going to hurt them. In a fast-paced game like Lighthoof, you have to make split-second decisions about whether to jump or dodge or attack or land. And the more punishing a game is for making mistakes, the more clear it has to be. In my opinion, one of the games that's worked the very hardest to give that clarity is Rogue Legacy 2. By associating specific VFX with certain types of interactions, they signal to the player exactly what abilities to use when confronted with a new obstacle. Even if you've never been attacked by these balloons before, you know because it has these rings surrounding it that they have a resonant effect, which means you can spin kick to damage them and you'll bounce higher off of them. There's a sacrifice there too. While these effects are visually appealing and well designed, it's not super immersive, is it? When I look at them, I find myself being very aware that I'm in a video game. Contrast that with the same mechanic in Hollow Knight. Down slashing on these lollipop mushrooms will spring you upward, just like spin kicking off of resonant enemies and obstacles in Rogue Legacy 2, but they look more visually tied into the environment. But there's a sacrifice there too. Maybe I should get roasted for this, but the first time I played Hollow Knight, I got completely stuck in this room and I had to look up what to do. It's never explained that you have to pogo off of the lollipop, so I just assumed I was missing an unlockable ability, turned around, explored elsewhere, and couldn't go further into the fungal wastes. Furthermore, by artistically tying it into the environment like this, you make it so that the same effect, bounciness, is harder to use in your other areas. I mean, you might be able to make another type of bouncy thing, but then your player would again wonder, what do I do with this? With the same possible mistaken assumptions that I made. If you limit bouncy things to one area, you can't develop that mechanic further by mixing it with abilities that you get later in the game. So you might end up missing some game design opportunities there, but it's not necessarily a problem. It's just part of Team Cherry's visual design, which prioritizes the aesthetic experience above all else. This brings us to number 3, everyone's favorite part of art style, which is tone. Tone is probably the first thing that comes to mind when someone says art style, but I've put it later on because I think it's one of the last considerations that you need to make. One reason is that tone is often set by other elements like writing. Consider a few games with a grim, tragic tone. Elden Ring springs to mind, but then so does Darkest Dungeon, Ender Lilies, Blasphemous, and Dishonored. The art styles may have some stuff in common, but they're also extremely different. You've got a muted 3D in Elden Ring, a 2D motion comic style with thick black lines in Darkest Dungeon, painted anime in Ender Lilies, detailed pixel art in Blasphemous, and this unique blend of angular edges and painterly textures in Dishonored. In those games, the art and the text work in harmony to underscore despair and desperation and decay. But some dissonance between the art and the tone can create an entirely new aesthetic experience. Cult of the Lamb's art style uses thick lines, bright colors, and chibi-like proportions that we associate with cuteness and fun, but the objective of the game is to brainwash people into laboring for you for their entire lives. If they dissent, you can sacrifice them to elder gods and serve the meat to other cultists. Like, in a cute way, though. The result is this one-of-a-kind brand of dark humor. When I sacrifice a cultist to the one who waits below, I might feel bad about it for a second, but then this cute animation makes me feel like it's just a silly little thing that's going on. The same exact action can happen in Skyrim. During one quest, there's an opportunity to sacrifice one of your followers to the Daedric god Boethia to advance. And this would make me feel terrible if I were ever able to actually do it. But I can't, because Skyrim presents its characters as if they're real people. The guilt would weigh on me forever. But then again, I'm also a person who would reset my save file if I accidentally chose a mean dialogue choice, so maybe it's a me problem. When making tone choices for your art style, you want to go right to the emotional core of the game. What do I want players to feel while they play? For Lighthoof, there are 4 emotional key tones that I want to hit. The melancholy of a dying world, the wonder of exploration, the thrill of danger, and the joy of connecting with the other characters. When I want the melancholy, I'm going to give dark values a lot of space on the frame to add that weightiness. I also might skew the color palette away from warm tones. To inspire wonder, I'm going to have to put a lot of energy into unique details between rooms. The style has to be representational and detailed enough to inspire questions about what these things were and where they came from and what their significance is in the story and history of the world. For danger, I'm using triangular shape language sometimes, and hot colors and high values that draw the eye. And as for connecting with characters, I want to use simple, often cute designs that inspire empathy and use big animations to express their personality. I'm hoping the dialogue portrait will also let my players connect to them more, and eventually I might expand this idea into expressive sprites that change along with the lines of dialogue, like in Hades or Shantae and the Pirate's Curse. The last factor that might influence your art style is a theme. Sometimes the style tells a story all by itself. By borrowing an existing visual language, you also borrow all of the associations with it that live in the public consciousness. As a prime example, let's look at Bioshock. The entire visual style is pulled from Art Deco, with its geometric patterns, neon signs, and blocky sans serif fonts. Art Deco's popularity peaked in the 1920s and 30s, where the ideology was pro-business, isolationist, and individualistic. The setting of Bioshock can then present its critique of that ideology by showing its natural conclusion, a submerged, violent, and apocalyptic environment. Of course, all the text in the game also overtly supports this interpretation, so the art style isn't doing all the heavy lifting by itself. But sometimes it can. Outside of games, in the movies of Studio Ghibli, the stylistic choices in the art present a philosophy that's echoed in the stories themselves. When watching one of these films, you'll often notice the extra time spent in certain actions. Characters move slowly in a labor-intensive animation style that emphasizes seemingly unimportant details of a story, like putting on a shoe or cutting a watermelon into slices. Hayao Miyazaki, co-founder of Studio Ghibli, says that in Japanese this is called ma, or negative space. And more than just being a way to arrange objects and time in art, it's part of a philosophy that values giving attention and presence over loud-spoken expression and constant action. I think a lot of people naturally pick up on this when they watch the films. There's also times when it's appropriate to just borrow a visual language for fun. Like in Jackbox Games' Fibbage 3, the graphic design and the colors and even the music is so 70s, it reminds you of one of those classic game shows. With a weird eyeball-laden twist. Anyway, those are the 4 that I could think of. Let me know if you have anything to add. I plan to keep making videos like this that are dives into video game development topics, so subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one!